Welcome to Global Unity Radio. I'm Elliot Baev. In this episode, we speak with Rupert Read. Rupert is a professor of philosophy, was a member of the Green Party where he sat as an elected city councillor for a number of terms, and most recently was instrumental in the founding of Extinction Rebellion, the youth-led global environmental movement. Rupert has written for The Guardian and The Independent and co-written pieces on the Precautionary Principle with Nassim Taleb. In this episode, we focus on his new book, Parents for a Future, as well as the movement behind it. As we discuss in the episode, one of the unique things about creating a movement of parents is that unlike so many other ways of bringing people together, it really crosses so many divisions from race to gender to nationality, and in this way offers some new hope for what we can all do together, notwithstanding that not only do parents have a vested interest in the future, but as we discuss, in many ways we're all parents. If it's true that it takes a village to raise a child, then we are all responsible for the next generation. And this mindset can really lead, hopefully, to a new way of seeing ourselves and our responsibility to each other and the earth and future generations. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I think you will too. Thank you for listening. Enjoy the episode and make sure to go to parentsforafuture.org where you can grab a copy of Rupert's book, and head to globalunity.org where you can sign up for a mailing list so you can be one of the first to hear more of the vision, mission, and ways in which you can participate. Enjoy the episode. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. We are here to speak with Rupert Read, who's got an amazing history of impact and activism, as well as academia, a lot of accomplishments within academia. He was a Green Party campaigner, part of the Extinction Rebellion, has written for The Independent and The Guardian, as well as being featured on multiple BBC programs, and has been an outspoken advocate for change for a long time in many different forms, and has recently written Parents for a Future, which is the main focus of today, but we're going to get into much of the bigger picture of Rupert's story first. So I appreciate everyone joining for System Changer Spotlight as part of Global Unity. So we're going to get right in. Rupert, before we get started, or before we dive into Parents for a Future specifically, love to have you give us a bit of a background on how you got started in activism in the first place.
Well, thanks, Elliot. Thanks for that thoughtful introduction. Thanks for the wonderful opportunity of speaking with you here today. I really, really appreciate it. So to answer your question, well, interestingly, you're talking to me from the US. I'm here in my home country of the UK. When I had done my undergraduate degree at Oxford and was continuing my education in the United States, doing a PhD at Rutgers, that is actually when I started to become more politically radicalized. The way it really happened is that I found the experience of seeing the reality of America at first hand pretty disturbing. Living in New Jersey, I was very disturbed by the incredible devastation of so much of the landscape there by industry. I was amazed to find the degree to which America was still a racially divided as well as economically divided country. And in a number of ways like this, really trends that I'd been disturbed by in the UK were just even more pronounced in the US. And, you know, a lot of things that happen in the US, they come to the UK 5 or 10 or 15 years later. That's the way it often works. So I kind of fell to thinking, this was around the start of the 1990s, kind of fell to thinking, gosh, is this really the future? It doesn't look good. And yeah, that's what propelled me to become much more politically assertive and turned on than I had done up until that point. And that's how I got involved with animal rights, direct action, and that's how I got involved with Earth First. I took part in Redwood Summer, defending the giant redwoods in 1990s, and so on. And so, yeah, that's how I got started with activism. And it sort of went in train in a way with the continuation of my academic education and career. But it was only much, much more recently that I started to actually write in a serious way as a philosopher about these kinds of things. So it's really only in the last 10 or 15 years that my two great loves, philosophy and environmental politics, have come together and joined together, and that's what's been at the root of most of the books that I've done in the last few years.
And can you tell us, before we dive too much deeper, just to give everyone a little background on your work as a philosopher, or on the academic side, just for a little context?
Yeah. So I did a lot of. I'm quite diverse as a philosopher. I've written a lot of philosophy of science, written some philosophy of literature, philosophy of film, philosophy of language, philosophy of mental health. And some of that has now fed into my work. So obviously, my work in the sort of green area, obviously there's a connection with philosophy of science, for example, because it's about thinking about the nature of, say, climate science and what we can know about the climate and how that can influence what we can do and how what we don't know can and should influence what we do, which is at the root of a lot of my work on the Precautionary Principle, for example, which has been very important to me in recent years, including the papers I've written on that with Nassim Taleb, author of The Black Swan. So, quite diverse, and some of it very much relating to the kind of stuff that I do now.
Wonderful. And how did, so you mentioned that it's only in the last few years that you started writing more, or perhaps even longer, that you've started writing more seriously about these philosophies, or your philosophy around the environment and activism. What was it that prompted, was there a catalytic moment that prompted you to take action in that form?
No, that was really more of a gradual process. So, like I say, in the 90s, I was politically radicalized by my time in the US. I came back to the UK, and that process kind of gradually continued. I started to get seriously involved in the Green Party in the UK around the year 2000. Became an elected Green Party councillor, served 2 terms in that capacity, stood for Parliament for the Greens. And all the time, of course, the environmental crisis is gradually getting worse, and I'm getting more and more concerned about it, starting to have terrible dreams about it, and all sorts of things like that, which perhaps some listeners are familiar with. And then there was a sort of step change in my development, really, about 4 years ago, which was I was doing some leafleting for the Green Party one day, and completely to my surprise, this thought, these 4 words just flipped into my head out of nowhere, it seemed to me, except a kind of vague sense of sort of depression and disconsolateness about the way things were going. And the words were, "This civilization is finished." And this was a very dramatic thought to have. I was very disturbed by it. I decided, as is the wont of an academic, to start writing about it, and that's what I did. And I wrote a paper which was unlike anything I'd ever written before, because it was so much more, quote, pessimistic, unquote. I was really not sure what to do about it, if anything. I shared it carefully with some very trusted friends, said, look, I'm really worried this is just going to demoralize people, or that I'm going to get attacked for saying it, but this is what I'm now thinking, this is what I'm now seeing, this shocking realization has come to me, what do you think? And the response was incredibly positive. Basically, people said to me, look, Rupert, actually, this looks like this is possibly the most important thing you've ever written. It's reaching a new level of sort of honesty and authenticity. And that's the way it felt to me as well. So obviously, I was encouraged by those responses, but still felt kind of guarded about it. So, long story short, I went through a process of first publishing This Civilization is Finished anonymously. And that went okay. I gave it as a talk with a lot of trepidation. That went really very well. People responded incredibly positively, which is, really not what I'd been expecting for obvious reasons. I started saying these things to my students, and they started saying to me things like, this feels like the first time any adult in authority has really leveled with us about how bad things are. So eventually, I gave it as a full-scale major lecture at Cambridge University. So this is now the autumn of 2018. And this talk called "The Civilization is Finished" went viral, and it and the subsequent versions of it, which I started to give in 2019, have been viewed hundreds of thousands of times on YouTube and so on, which obviously is quite good and slightly unusual for a really long, in-depth and somewhat painful lecture. And in case people are not sure what exactly I mean by saying this civilization is finished, let me be very clear. I don't mean that we are bound to collapse. What I mean is that the only way we now get to avoid eco-induced societal collapse is by changing our civilization fundamentally and rapidly. That transformation is coming. The only question is, are we going to manage to do it ourselves, or is it going to be done to us by, as it were, an enraged Gaia? So that's the essence of "This Civilization is Finished," which appeared as a book then in 2019 and became a bit of a sort of, well, I don't know, sort of cult classic, I suppose you could say, of a small kind. And of course, around this time, in autumn 2018, it's also the exact same time that Extinction Rebellion was just starting to emerge on the scene. And as soon as I found out about the birth of Extinction Rebellion, I was enormously excited. Got in touch with one of the founders, Gail Bradbrook, that same day, and had a long, amazing conversation. She invited me to help launch Extinction Rebellion, which I then did by putting together with others the letter that was published in The Guardian that launched the movement onto the public scene, and by emceeing with Gail the launch event outside the House of Parliament in October 2018, when we blocked the access to Houses of Parliament by means of vehicles, and that was the first direct action we did. And so, yeah, that's really when my life kind of really changed in quite a significant way, when I did the "This Civilization is Finished" talk and got involved in the launch of Extinction Rebellion, and it's never been quite the same since.
And I got to watch that after the protest. You were invited, I think it was maybe Channel 5. I remember you using that as an opportunity to really share the message behind Extinction Rebellion powerfully, and then invite, I believe they were politicians, in for some dialogue. Could you tell us a bit about how all that unfolded and what came of that moment, and maybe more of the story of your involvement with Extinction Rebellion, and even some background for those who might not be familiar?
Sure. So Extinction Rebellion basically was founded with the idea that the environmental movement had not been radical enough, not been honest enough, not addressed the way in which we are causing an extinction. They call it the sixth mass extinction, biologists call it that. And are ourselves possibly even in danger of extinction if we really don't clean up our act in a very significant way. And the idea is, well, governments that are leading us off this cliff can't really be legitimate. So it should be okay for us to rise up in rebellion against them, provided that rebellion is done in the same kind of traditions of non-violence and non-harm that you saw famously in Gandhi's movement or Martin Luther King's, or a number of other famous examples through history, of course. And so that's what Extinction Rebellion is. And in spring 2019, it really took off in the UK especially. And I was involved in the Extinction Rebellion political strategy team. Our real task was to get ready for conversing with the government should the opportunity arise. And I must tell you, it didn't seem entirely likely or realistic that it was going to arise, that the government were going to invite a ragtag group of environmentalists to come and speak with them. But when we did the April Rebellion in 2019 in London, Well, the response was amazing, and yeah, you can watch many of us who took part in that on many channels, etc. You can watch that on YouTube. You're referring, I think, to the Channel 5 thing that I did, which was focused on our children and the way that the school climate strikers are begging for their lives, and that Extinction Rebellion is an attempt to rise up in response to that, for adults to really take responsibility. And the government felt some pressure from this, and to the surprise, really, in the end, honestly, of many of us, they became willing to talk, and I arranged with a bit of help from Greta Thunberg, who pinned them down in public. I arranged the meeting with Michael Gove, the then Environment Secretary, which took place at the end of that period of rebellion. And straight after that, the British Parliament declared a climate and environment emergency. So it was an exciting time, and that declaration sort of echoed around the world, and Extinction Rebellion, of course, has been active at that time and since in many other countries, including the US. And yeah, there's been a permanent shift in the discourse and in the status of concern for climate and ecology, I would argue, as a result of Extinction Rebellion, combined with, of course, Greta Thunberg and the climate school strikes. And yeah, that's really a key part of the background to where we are now, and to whatever hope there is of the right kind of stuff happening in the next few years.
Mm-hmm. And before we dive too deep in, or before we shift gears to Parents for a Future, so you mentioned the discourse has evolved in a positive way. Did you see through this stating that there is a climate emergency, did you see actual change start to take place, or what did you see beyond just discourse?
Yeah, that, of course, is the $64 million question. It's crucial. And, well, as my colleague Greta has said, the actual amount of real change on the ground is still pretty small. We've had an awful lot of discourse, and we've had some laws passed, like in the UK, a law committing us to net zero carbon by 2050, for example. That too occurred right after Extinction Rebellion's rebellion in 2019. But how much has actually changed on the ground? There are some things one can point to. For example, it looks like some of what's happened around the cost of flying in Scotland has been pretty directly influenced by Extinction Rebellion. That's quite a specific example. It's often, of course, difficult to really pin down political changes to particular movements or influences. Often politicians don't like to admit why they've changed their mind on something. They often don't like to admit they've changed their mind at all. So it's not surprising that there isn't too much that can be directly attributed to these change-making movements. But it is certainly disappointing that there hasn't been a widespread change. And I guess it's fair to say that this is one of the reasons why over the last several months I've moved on from Extinction Rebellion myself, and I'm taking a somewhat different approach now. And I'm sure we'll get to this soon. On the one hand, I am arguing for a bigger, more inclusive, in a certain sense, more moderate movement to try to fill the space and use the space that the agenda-changing effect of Extinction Rebellion and others has had. And that includes my call for a much broader mobilization, if you will, of concerned parents. And on the other hand, I've also put in an increased emphasis on the need to take adaptation seriously, because the tragic reality is that it was already horribly late in 2018, 2019 to be really moving on prevention or so-called mitigation of the climate and ecological emergency. And, well, we're now in 2021, and sure, we've been given a little bit of inadvertent help by the coronavirus to not blow all our climate targets sky high, but the signs are that we're bouncing back towards so-called business as usual, when actually what we need is a thoroughly transformed normal. So the bitter truth is that not enough change at all is happening on the ground, and certainly at the policy level. And the bitter truth is that it's too late to prevent dangerous climate change. It's here. We've seen our weather starting to spin out of control all around the world. We've seen bizarre, unprecedented things in the last 4, 5, 6 years. Very, very concerning. And what it means is we're going to have to adapt. And that is not giving up, but that is facing the reality that it just doesn't wash anymore to say, oh, look, if we all pull together, we can stop this problem. No, the problem is here. The genie is out of the box. So I have moved on from Extinction Rebellion to a considerable extent, although I'm still very much an ally of XR and still sometimes give talks at XR events and so forth. But I've moved on because I think that we need to be talking about and doing adaptation more than Extinction Rebellion has been doing and talking about. And because I think we need a larger, more moderate movement that will be attractive to more people. And I think that's possible now. I think that the Youth Climate Strikers and XR have created a space which new organizations can and should move into. And that's an essential area now for the work that I'm trying to accomplish.
Right on. That's a good place to kind of take us into, or start to take us into, Parents for a Future. And even the question of what actual change have you seen is, in a sense, an unfair one, because the changes we need, if they were to take place within this system, are so long term. And I appreciate your point that we need really broad systemic change and even a whole new system. So talk to us about the genesis of Parents for a Future, where the idea came from, and what the overarching theme is, before we kind of dig into some of the particulars.
Yeah, so this new book of mine, Parents for a Future, it's something I've been working on in a way for a very long time. It emerges from my philosophical work. It goes back to thinking I was doing really in the early 2000s about how we could create a much broader and deeper mobilization of the climate and nature concerned people around the world. And the idea essentially is this: that what most human beings have in common is that they are parents, or they want to be parents, or if not, then they're aunts or uncles, or they adopt children, or they're godparents, or you see what I'm getting at. Nearly everybody has some kind of very direct and very meaningful connection to the next generation. And the thought I had was, well, look, surely that iterates, that carries forward into the future. In other words, if our love for our children is as absolutely central to our lives and the meanings of those lives as we say it is, then we have to be in a position to, as much as possible, ensure that that kind of love can carry on. In other words, that our children can get to share their love with their children too. And you see where this is heading. It heads off into the sunset. It heads off into the distant future. And of course, family trees, if you look at your own family tree or any family tree, they get larger and larger as they go forward in time, right? They expand. So anybody's descendants are likely to gradually be more and more numerous and cover more and more of the earth. Now, this, of course, is not an argument for having more children, right? And in fact, ironically, you might say, I myself decided a long time ago not to have children because, as I think an increasing number of us are realizing, that the best way we can safeguard the children of the world that there are and that there will be on a personal basis is potentially not to add even more numbers to them. For me, my nephews and nieces are very important in my life. Anyway, the point is not to say go forth and multiply. The point is simply to observe that over time, people's descendants are typically more numerous and typically spread around wider zones of this planet. And what this means is that really caring for your own children translates into really caring for distant future generations across the whole world, because you can't really succeed in caring for your children if they're not able to care for their children, and so on and so on. And of course, what that means, and this is the argument of the book that I'm giving to you here, really in a nutshell, what that means is that we have to be serious about putting in place protection for distant future generations around the world. What that means is that we've got to protect our ecosystems. We've got to protect this world. We've got to protect the earth. Because to the best of our knowledge, it's not going to be possible for future people to flourish if the earth is not flourishing. So without having to care about the environment, without having to care for animals or trees or anything, it turns out that just by virtue of caring for your own children, you're committed to caring for nature, for trees, for animals, and into the distant future, moreover. So really, the essential argument of my book, Parents for a Future, is that by virtue of being a parent, or as I say, an aunt or uncle or a grandparent or godparent, whatever it is, by virtue of parenting the future, you're committed to trying to play your part seriously in parenting the whole future. And that means taking care of the earth. So the conclusion of my book is we need to have a new coming together, a new uprising, a new mobilization of concerned parents and all concerned adults who have a sense of and a stake in the future, especially parents. Parents should come together and think, look, we need to protect the future together, otherwise our kids are not going to have a future. In the past, it's been possible for parents to think, well, if I just make sure I look after my kids' health and get them into a good school and so on, then I'm really taking care of them. But that's no longer possible. The situation has changed. The earth is in the balance. And that's really the kicker in Parents for a Future. That's the challenging, but I think logically unassailable message of its sort of emotional logic, if you will. That if you're a parent, you're committed to doing what is necessary to seek to protect the future of the earth. And that almost certainly means for most of us doing a lot more than what we're currently doing. That's what the book is about. And well, it's getting quite an interesting response, as I expected that it might.
I love so much of what you said, and two of my favorite quotes that really overlap from the book are caring for your kids means you'll care for the whole human future, and caring for our children isn't real if it doesn't include some level of concern for their children too, and just this understanding that not only is it future generations that must be in our hearts if we care about our children, but also the whole of all of our ecosystems, or the earth as a whole. And so, yeah, I think there's some deep wisdom in that that really speaks to what it is to be a parent. Really a caretaker of the future. And one thing that for me struck me is basically as soon as I learned the title, before I even got into the content of the book, there are so many wonderful groups working to make change, whether locally or more broadly. So often when you come together in groups, when you include folks in a particular group, you tend to exclude them from other groups, or that you tend to exclude others from that group. But one unique thing about parents is it crosses all divisions.
Yes.
It crosses divisions of gender, race, age, and really, for me, is an innovation in thinking about how we form coalitions, so to speak, or how we form movements, because we are all, I don't, and you speak to this in different ways. you don't need to be a parent to be a parent. You know, if a child
Yeah.
is raised by a village, then we're all parents. We're all parents of the
Yeah.
next generation, and that responsibility is on all of our shoulders. Um,
Yeah.
I think there's beautiful wisdom in that. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for that really lovely response and summation, Elliot. I think you've absolutely got it there. You've absolutely got what I was trying to do. And yeah, this can give us some kind of hope in the desperate situation that we're in, it seems to me. That here, and it hasn't been fully tapped yet, it really hasn't, is an extraordinary basis for, well, the project that you call in your work, Elliot, global unity, a way of coming together across barriers, across divisions, across identities. It seems to me that if there is going to be a future, it's not going to be a future in which we're more and more balkanized from each other in separate identities or kind of culturally warring units. It's going to be a future in which we find our unity, find our essential common interest, which is very real, and find and re-find our nature. Let's remember what we are. We're human beings. We're mammals. What are we if we don't take care of our offspring? We've failed in what we ourselves judge, and rightly so, to be an absolutely central category, perhaps for many people the central category of our lives. So yeah, it's a basis for a new kind of hope, and for, as I say, potentially a broader kind of movement. Now, as you implied, also there are elements of this that already exist. So, for example, there is an excellent international organization called Parents for Future, which is modeled on Fridays for Future, the acronym that the school climate strikers most often use. I think because each of the words began with F, I think that's why they called it Fridays for Future rather than Fridays for a Future. And these organizations very much deserve our support or involvement. And what I'm really hoping is that my book might play at least a small role in helping to catalyze this kind of growth and in this kind of moment. And it really is a very crucial moment that we're sitting in here. So if we look at the coronavirus crisis, for instance, which has sucked up such a lot of attention, and if we look at where that now leaves us, we're of course facing in most of the world an attempt to, quote, rebuild, unquote, economies in response to the crisis. Now, if that rebuilding, if the post-COVID reset, as it's sometimes called, occurs in a way which is anti-green, and there are many signs that it is doing so or that it will do so, as well as some optimistic signs. If it occurs in a way that is anti-green, well, it's really a kind of game over, to be honest. The hope that some of us still cherish, that the 2020s might see a great turning, a great transformation, that hope will be dashed. So this is a very, very important moment. And I think it's a moment at which any parent listening, and as you say, actually, Elliot, we're kind of all parents in this. That any parent should be thinking something like this. So in the coronavirus crisis, we took care of our old people, yeah? We did our best to try to reduce the immense suffering that they were threatened with at the hands of the virus. And many of them have died, but many more would have died if it hadn't been for the way that we did actually, to some real extent, pull together in this crisis and act responsibly, and we were willing to give things up, like, travel as normal and so on and so forth. Well, that's the same kind of thing that we need to do now with the climate and ecological emergency. We need to do it bigger and deeper and for longer, and we need to do it for our children. So we've sacrificed for our elders. Are we willing also to sacrifice for our young people? And once you put it like that, surely we are, right? Surely our elders are very, very important to us. Absolutely, of course. Our fathers, mothers, and elders arguably should get even more respect in our society than they in fact do. Elders often have more respect, for example, in indigenous or peasant cultures than they do in our own, and that's something that should change. But at least an old person has lived a pretty full life in most cases, right? Whereas there's something peculiarly terrible and unacceptable to us, and rightly so, I think, about a disease which, as some past pandemics have done, takes our 5-year-olds, our 10-year-olds, our 15-year-olds, and so forth. Well, it is the young people who are most at risk from the climate and ecological emergency. That is absolutely clear. That is fact. Because this situation is spinning out of control, and that's what we've got to try to stop, or at least slow down and find more effective ways of dealing with it. So as we come out of the coronavirus crisis, as we will do over the next year or 2 or 3, we absolutely must future-proof against the even worse, longer emergency of climate and ecology. And that is a fundamental aspect of my message in Parents for a Future.
You speak early in the book, and incidentally, for everyone in the room, you can get the book on Amazon. It's also on audiobook through Audible, and the ebook is very, very affordable. So just want to throw that in. But at the
can I just
please,
chip
yeah.
in, Elliot, that do rather than going to Amazon, if you can, go to our own website at www.parentsforafuture.org. And that's actually quite a good place to get the book quite cheaply, unless you want the Audible version.
Yeah, thank you for that. You speak early in in the book about our inability to kind of conceive of or conceptualize the future. Coronavirus, it was an immediate threat that we could, that was very kind of in our face. How do you see us? And unfortunately, the climate crisis is becoming more in our face. But I'm wondering what are some ways you think we can communicate the severity of the risk and the scale and scope of the emergency, so that it does become more clear to folks who maybe aren't as involved in spaces like this.
Yeah, well, again, a very, very important question. So let's start with the coronavirus, and let's put it like this: that some countries in the world responded adequately to the immediacy of the threat of the coronavirus. Other countries, of course, didn't, even though it was pretty obvious what was coming. So the US, the UK, Brazil, these were among the countries that responded very slowly and poorly. And as a result, we've got some of the absolute highest death rates in the world. And this is despite the fact that these are rich, so-called developed countries, you know. You'd have expected there to be in a great position to deal with a pandemic, but atrociously poor politics and governance led to a terrible cost, which in the case of the UK I've written about in my my recent ebook called the timeline of the plague year, which is a timeline of what happened with the coronavirus in the UK. So even with something that was a fairly immediate threat, still not all of us responded sufficiently to it. The climate and ecological emergency is always going to be slower burning. As you say, it's gradually catching up with us, but it's never going to be as in our faces, even as the coronavirus, let alone as something, still more urgent, like, a car that is literally hurtling towards you or something. Everyone knows to jump out of the way of that, but we're not so good at jumping out of the way of a virus, and we're terrible at jumping out of the way of a climate breakdown. So if we are waiting until the climate crisis is absolutely in our faces and unavoidable, we're going to be waiting forever, and it's going to sweep us away way before we get to that point. So we have to find ways of thinking ahead, of being more rational to the extent that we can. And we have to find ways, as your question implied, of communicating the threat in a way which enables people to see it as being something more immediate. Now, on that point, I do have an idea and a suggestion, which I've tried to practice in the last few years, especially actually in my time as an Extinction Rebellion spokesperson, which is that I think we need to talk a lot more about our vulnerability, and in particular the vulnerability of those who are already vulnerable, but the vulnerability of all of us potentially to the actual effects now and very soon of climate chaos and of ecological breakdown and damage. And those effects are things like food shortages, which we've had some real cases of already in the last few years. Those effects are things like out of control fires. Look at what's happened in California. Look at what's happened in Australia over the last 12 to 18 months. I think we need to be focusing a lot more on these things and a lot less on talking about 2100 or 2050 or even 2030 or 2035. We need to be focusing people's minds on the fact that already now, and we can see this happening as it were in real time, already now we're becoming more vulnerable to the climate emergency and the broader ecological crisis. And if we don't get serious about this, there could be really, even much more than we've already had, dire consequences really soon. I don't think it's impossible that there will be serious mass food shortages, including in parts of the so-called developed world, in this decade or even in the next few years. I think that is entirely possible, and that thinking is based partly on the increasingly worrisome scientific, etc., reports which are put out about this. So rather than emphasizing the need for long-term emissions reductions, I think we should be talking more about the global weirding, about the climate chaos and so forth that we are already starting to see. And I think we should be encouraging people to feel into this increasing year on year, right now, increasing vulnerability that we have to this terrible situation that we've created for ourselves. And I think if we focused in that way, and that of course connects with the theme I mentioned briefly earlier, the theme of adaptation, the idea that we actually have to try to find ways of living on this world that is now already changed, already climate changed in a dangerous way. If we focus more on that and less only on, as we have tended to do so far, and less only on reducing emissions for everybody's benefit in the future, I think that could be rather game-changing. And one final point on that, here's one of the ways it could be game-changing. I believe, and I've seen some evidence of this, that when we start to talk or even just think about adaptation, when we start to get serious about responding to the crisis that already exists, when we get serious about trying to create resilience right now, that itself makes the crisis more psychologically real to us. As long as we're talking about net zero 2050 and laws to try to reduce our carbon emissions and so forth, it doesn't quite seem present. It doesn't quite seem real. It seems somehow deniable to nearly all of us, nearly all of the time, not just to the Donald Trumps of this world. But once we start getting into the area of adaptation, then we're admitting that it's real. Then we have to face it. So that is another powerful argument, and I mentioned this in Parents for a Future. That is a powerful argument for climate organizations and for people concerned with what we're doing to our ecology and to nature to spend a little bit more time focusing on the need for us to adapt and on the vulnerability that we are increasingly exposed to, which lies at the basis of that need.
First, I think that's really both harrowing and important for how we focus on the more immediate concerns. You spoke, I think you were speaking to children in one of the videos I saw, and you talked about how drought or extreme heat, maybe a summer or two ago, caused not a food shortage, but 1/3 of crops, or 1/3 of the crop yield was destroyed. Yeah. And that had that heat wave gone into August or September, that could have had even more catastrophic impacts. And I think, so first, actually, I wanted to kind of shout out your emphasis on talking to children, which of course would have been part of Extinction Rebellion's or your work with Extinction Rebellion. But even before that, I think you had written articles on Leave Our Kids Alone, anti-advertising to kids. And I think that is so important. But I want to make sure we dig into or get to hear a bit more about what I know that Parents for a Future ends with a proposal. Can you tell us some of the specifics of what that looks like as we're talking about envisioning, a better system or movement towards one? How you propose we actually get there?
Yeah, so it comes back to what I was already getting at a little earlier in our conversation, that I see what's happened in the last few years with the growth of ecological awareness, certainly relative to where we were a few years ago. That growth being propelled, especially by Greta Thunberg, by Extinction Rebellion, by David Attenborough also. I see this as having created some space. And this space now needs to be moved into. It needs to be made the most of. And I think there are many ways in which that could happen. I think people should be thinking about what they can do through their workplaces, for example. I think that's a key area where we can go a lot further than we have done so far, many of us, to achieve and start to leverage real change, regardless of what governments do. But an absolutely key area, and this is the point I make at the end of Parents for a Future in my proposal for how to go forward. An absolutely key area is in our role as parents of the future. And of course, there are multiple overlaps here, right? Most people have a workplace, and most people have nearly everybody has some kind of parental or quasi-parental role. The two could overlap. You could express perhaps your concern for the future by what you do in your work. And that I make clear at the end of my book that's a very real possibility. But what I say is that, look, one way or another, we need a kind of broader awakening and a broader mobilization of some kind that tries to get parents to step up at this crucial time and to see that there is no one riding to the rescue. I mean, look at the recent G7 summit. They came up with some good things. Came out with some good stuff, some good promises on nature, for example, on nature preservation and marine preservation. We'll see if the promises get delivered on. They came up with some good things, but they came up with stuff which is just so far short of where we actually need to be. And Elliot, it's going to be the same, I'm afraid, virtually certainly later this year at the crucial climate summit in Glasgow, the so-called COP in Glasgow in November. Well, parents and all of us need to be mobilizing in response to this. We need to be recognizing that there is no cavalry coming, that this issue cannot be outsourced any longer, that we have to start to take it into our own hands intelligently if there is to be a future. So, yeah, I call for ways of making the idea of Parents for a Future into a reality. And that could be a sort of bespoke movement, or it could be a souped-up version of the wonderful existing organizations already emerging in this sphere, or it could be things that are happening in areas like what's going on in the workplace, or it could be done through striking, potentially. Our children have gone on strike, so for goodness sake, can't we do the same? These are the kind of possibilities I lay out at the end of the book, and I hope it's an agenda that people will find rich and thought-provocative, and obviously I really hope it's an agenda that people jump on board with and respond to in creative ways that I probably can't even envision.
One thing I appreciated about researching some of your work is even prior to your work on Extinction Rebellion was your emphasis on decentralized governance and recognizing that the current democratic systems aren't effective for what we need today. And I believe you spoke to citizen assemblies and the idea of, this identity almost of guardians for future generations and the precautionary principle. Wondering if you could speak about each of those, because I feel that, say we did successfully create the kind of movement we need, whether it be parents exclusively or something even broader, but we did have this movement. There's still the question of decision making, and this room has been alternating between decentralized governance and this system changer spotlight to feature folks like yourself. So I'd be curious to hear more of this citizen assembly idea and how that might influence how this movement of parents can actually collectively decide on the direction forward.
Yeah, very interesting. So yeah, I believe very strongly that the future is more local, is more decentralized. I think this is bound to be the case. Again, I think it will happen either because we deliberately make it so, or it'll be forced upon us, because if society starts to collapse, it becomes more local at 99 times out of 100. That's just a default situation. And also, if we're talking about trying to create local governance, that's of course a really good reason to be taking that project seriously, to be sort of insured against the possibility of a kind of partial societal breakdown. If that's going to occur, you want to have more local governance experience and setups in place, ready to step into that scenario. But we can also hope that we may be able to avert that scenario and relocalization, reducing supply lines, reducing our vulnerability in that way, becoming more self-sufficient and self-reliant. These are ways in which we can reduce the risk of societal breakdown. So yeah, you're asking me to speak in that context to these three ideas that I put forward in chapter 4 of the book, which two of which, of course, are not original to me. So there's the idea of citizens' assemblies, which has been very prominent in the discourse of Extinction Rebellion, brilliantly so, I think, a brilliant idea for how to do an end run around the weaknesses of our so-called representative democracy and hand a significant tranche of power to citizens who get randomly selected, like a jury. It's a sort of super jury. Citizens who get randomly selected to make decisions on our part on the basis of the absolute best information and expertise, and with the opportunity for them to deliberate, to really think about their decisions in ways that voters and, for that matter, politicians don't usually deliberate. So I think citizens' assemblies are a crucial wave of the future if there is to be a decent future. And we've already seen evidence of that in a number of places. For example, the successful experiment with citizens' assemblies in Ireland that led to the big constitutional changes there in recent years, such as the abolition of the prohibition against homosexuality. And the very impressive citizens' assembly recently in France that President Macron brought in as a response to the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Jackets protest, which was a protest against his regressive climate tax that he tried to bring in, the carbon tax he tried to bring in. So he said, all right, look, I've obviously kind of messed up here. Let's have a citizens' assembly to sort out what to do about it. That was a smart move. Citizens' assembly give politicians cover to do things that politicians in most cases actually know need to be done anyway. Then there's the precautionary principle, which we mentioned briefly before, a key element of my work building on the absolutely vital jurisprudence of the last 50-odd years about how it's vital for states and others to act cautiously with regard to our future, meaning to not recklessly put us at risk in the way that we are put at risk by companies when they seek to operate with very short-term horizons in selfish ways to make profits. So a potential example would be some of the pesticides that have been designed or used in recent years, which it's suspected are involved in killing bees in large numbers. This is very, very worrying, as well as being very tragic and sad. So these pesticides, do we have to wait till they are proven categorically to be killing the bees before we move to act? No, the precautionary principle says we should be able to move ahead of the full information that could come from research when the situation is really dire and urgent, and we can't afford to just wait around for the results of the research. So some pesticides have been banned by the European Union in recent years, for example, pending the results of research. And the onus has been put on the makers of the pesticide to prove that they're safe, rather than for the people who suspect that bees are being killed by these pesticides to have to prove that categorically. The precautionary principle, in my opinion, is a vital tool in our having a safer and more secure future, which doesn't look likely, but if it's going to happen, it'll happen partly through us being more precautious. And then finally, there's the idea which I developed, which you kindly mentioned, of guardians for future generations, which is a sort of special kind of citizens' assembly, which I think there should be, to take care proactively of the interests of unborn future generations and of the very young, who of course are not able to vote yet, not able to stand up in our democratic sphere and look after themselves yet. So this innovation, like citizens' assemblies, should be seen as a kind of way of enhancing our democracy. That a democracy is imperfect if it doesn't include proper opportunities for deliberation and expertise. A democracy is imperfect if it doesn't include the future. It shouldn't just be about the interests of people who are alive right now. And I would add, I think a democracy is imperfect if it doesn't include the kind of long-termism that is also embedded in the precautionary principle, which should be thought of as a sort of fundamental constitutional principle that's inviolate. And, any sound democracy has to have a sound constitution. So, yeah, those are my three top sort of high-level policy recommendations in Parents for a Future. If we were to make those changes, I think they would be quite literally game-changing. I think the chances that we'll do that, again, are slim, but I think we have to try. It's what one really doesn't want, right, is to be an old man or an old woman looking back on one's life and saying, maybe if we'd tried a bit harder, we could have stopped the kind of out of control ecological degradation, which perhaps is going to be coming during the 2020s. So we've got to do what we can. We've got to throw ourselves into the ring while there's still any room for maneuver and any chance of the transformation that we need. And these are the kinds of ways in which we could, I believe, bring it about.
Well, whether we are likely to bring these in within the current system or not, I think they are a bit of a guiding light to a definition of what an effective system would look like. And that's where, I appreciated your emphasis on the need for a really a new system, because that's very aligned with the whole thesis behind global unity, that not only do we need people to come together, but it's not to just affect this current system. We need a new system that is based on new principles, or maybe more to the point, old principles,
Yes.
but principles that can facilitate sustaining and a thriving future for all generations to come.
Yes.
So I want to make sure we open it up to those in the audience to come up and ask questions, make comments. But anything we didn't get to cover, or any thoughts you'd like to share before we do?
Well, no, except just one point on that thing that you mentioned there about, in a way, this is about going back to the future, or really learning from the past, because I think that's such an important point. There have been civilizations which were more intelligently long-termist than ours. A lovely example is the seventh generation rule practiced by some Native American tribes that said, as you may know, that any major decision should be assessed for its impact on the seventh generation from now. Now, just imagine if we were to bring that into our system. And by contrast, ask yourself, when was the last time that you heard a politician on the stump saying, well, you know what I'm really concerned about here today is thinking about how things are going to be here in 150 years' time. That's what we've got to focus on. It never happens, right? And that just shows you that the kind of thing which is missing from our system. That's the kind of ruling philosophical idea, if you will, which I would love to see us trying to contribute to at this time when we so badly need it.
Well, I think it's not just that long-termism is missing. I think even more to the point, it's incentivized against. With four-year election cycles, politicians can't be thinking long term because they have to be thinking about what's going to get them reelected in the next 4 years. So, and this is where so much of the thinking behind what a new, better system would look like has been focused on what are some better incentive structures that, even when you were speaking to the precautionary principle and the we have to make sure that the pesticide will not harm bees or other animals or humans before putting it out rather than retroactively pulling it back once we discover that it does. Well, why is anyone doing the opposite? It's because the producers because the producers are incentivized to make the money that they'll earn by selling it. And so are thus also incentivized to lobby to push it through and to diminish regulations and maybe more insidiously are incentivized to think of the regulations as flawed because of the incentive structures that focus them on how do we make the most profit as soon as possible. So I'd love to hear any reflections on incentives, but I wanted to also take the opportunity to invite anyone in the audience who had any comments or questions for Rupert on anything we've discussed or any ideas you have to come on up and share. But and we'll bring you up shortly. Feel free to put your hand up. But Rupert, any thoughts on incentives, whether in this system or a better system?
Well, look, Elliot, I totally agree with what you just said, of course. And the incentives we've got in our political economy are in many cases all wrong. There are so many examples we could give of this. One very important one is the discount rate, right? It's a little bit technical, but it's so important. It's very shocking to some people when they find out about it that there is a rate at which economists discount the interests of future generations. That each year that goes by, they say it's a little bit less important than the present. And they claim in this way to be merely reflecting the way that people actually think. But I'm not convinced that's true. Because I know many, many parents, for example, who will say, and I think they mean it, look, my children are desperately important to me. I would make big sacrifices for them. And of course, people do that. Many, many parents across the millennia have made real sacrifices in the present for a better future for their children. But economists in this way have been very influential on our governance. They quite literally discount the future. And the higher the discount rate, the more worthless the future compared to the present. That is a sort of gigantic kind of perverse incentive built into the very structure of virtually every political economy in the world. So that's at a high level. That's something I would love to see changing. The discount rate should be abolished. The future should be regarded as just as important as the present, no less. Perhaps no more, but certainly no less. But let me make one more point, and then let's go to the raised hands that we have. It's also really important that we don't get overly focused on economic incentives for good or for ill. And what I'm getting at there is our society is terribly dominated by economics. Now, in response to that, it's very natural, and we should certainly do this, to think carefully about, well, okay, how can we alter the economic incentives in an intelligent way? But what I'm trying to say now is that so long as that's all that we do, we're still staying too much within the game of business as usual and economics as usual. And actually, we really need to be loud and clear that there are many things in life which cannot be economically valued and that are more important than anything that can be economically valued. I'm sure that everyone knows the kind of thing I mean. Classic examples are things like love. And it's literally absurd to think of love, the actual real thing, being for sale. It's incompatible with that. So we need to make sure that when we're talking politics, when we're talking philosophy, when we're talking spirituality, when we're talking art, when we're talking many of the things that really matter to us most, we don't just talk economics, and we don't sort of make it sound as though everything can be reduced to numbers, everything can be reduced to money. It can't, and thank God it can't.
One of the points there, and I really appreciate that emphasis on not focusing exclusively on economics. And this speaks to the need not just for better incentives within this system, but really a whole new system with a new concept of really what we are and what we're here to do. So appreciate that. Want to, as you said, move to the raised hands. So we'll have Callan and then your own and the others who've put their hand up. Go ahead, Callan. Welcome.
Hey, thank you for the welcome and thanks for the talk so far. I've really enjoyed it. So as somebody who's been peripherally interested in nature for a long time, and also interested in psychology and economics and all these things, I see a common thread that is a bit kind of under the radar from what I see from the current narrative of Extinction Rebellion, for example. It seems like we're prioritizing the CO2 thing disproportionate to the actual priorities that I think the ecology is screaming for, which is, I think we should prioritize trees, soil, and water. And the CO2 thing is kind of could be leveraged to go tie in the hands of a materialistic consumerist economy by kind of pushing electric cars, pushing more consumption of a different format, just like how veganism is starting to be corrupted by the processed food industry. I feel like it's not how many people we are on the planet, it's how we're living. And I like how you touched on also about economic incentives, and it's not everything, but it definitely is part of the solution. And they're very skewed in favor of systemic kind of polluting of the environment, basically. But I do think it's a bottom-up approach as well. And it's easy to be a reductionist to say everything's economic, but at the same time, our time and money is a form of energy. And I feel like if you wanted to lose weight, you don't want to exercise. It's more about what you're not doing. So if you just don't eat food, it's much easier to lose weight than having to force yourself to exercise, for example. So I feel like, it's great to put our energy and money into organic farming locally and community work. But I think the biggest thing we can do is stop our addiction to materialist consumption and just mindless kind of addictions like that. Just not buying things that are produced in other countries and produce a lot of waste and pollution. So that's a big bottom-up thing I believe in personally. And I really like that you touched on this kind of parental paradigm. I kind of see the world in a psychological triage way, like a Jungian analyst, how everything can be boiled down to the mother, father, child relationship in some form. And it could be on any scale of analysis, where it could be the family unit, or it could be even political systems. They can oftentimes become parents to us and a bit too invasive and stopping us as individuals, the civilians, from actually flourishing and becoming adults and taking personal responsibility. So I am a bit concerned about that also, this kind of potential trend towards enforcing these draconian laws under the guise of ecological protection, but really it's more of a pathology of trying to control us in a kind of weird kind of parental complex where we get infantilized. Sorry, I just threw a lot of stuff at you.
That's really interesting stuff, Callum. I agree with the vast majority of what you said, if I understood it all, which I think I understood most of it. Fascinating stuff. So the point about energy, just briefly, of course, really the way we do economics should be in a deep green ecological way, and there are a small number of economists, a growing number, who do that. But the point I was making is that even if we do economics in that way, there are still and will always be things that cannot be and should not be subsumed under the disciplinary heading of economics. What we don't want to do in trying to make economic incentives better and to make economics as a discipline better is kind of give the impression that economics is the only game in town. It's vital to the human project, if you will, that we are diverse beings and that much of what is most important to us simply cannot be understood by economics, however good your economics is. Now, on the points about biodiversity, habitats, ecology, and not just climate, very, very important. And I basically agree with you. When I was in Extinction Rebellion, I was one of those who was pushing for there to be more of an emphasis on ecology and not just a single-minded emphasis on climate. Climate is really the canary in the coal mine. Climate is the worst current crisis so far as human beings are concerned. But it is a symptom of a way of living, of a civilizational paradigm which is rotten. And it is a pathological symptom among many other pathological symptoms in terms of how our ecosphere is faring. You can see this quite clearly if you want to by looking at the recent BBC program, which I would recommend to people, on breaking boundaries. This is the latest David Attenborough program, which I hope is now available all over the world, which concerns the way in which we're rupturing our planetary boundaries. And the program makes the point very clearly that the climatic boundary is a very important boundary, but it is not the only one. It is one of many. And we are rupturing a whole load of them at the same time and set to rupture more of them unless we manage to undertake this unparalleled transformation that I've been trying to get at in this conversation with Elliot. So yes, it's not enough to talk about carbon and climate. And in fact, even talking about climate is always much more than talking about carbon. And climate and biodiversity overlap so thoroughly that to look at the Amazon, for example. The Amazon is hugely important as a store of carbon. It's also hugely important as a store, if you will, of biodiversity. And it's hugely important in terms of the water cycle of the continent and to some extent of the Earth. And it's important in terms of generating oxygen. It has multiple ecological importances, and it can't just be reduced to a carbon store. It's very dangerous to so reduce it. So yeah, Extinction Rebellion and all other such organizations, and Extinction Rebellion has got a lot better at this, by the way, as it's evolved, need to be talking about biodiversity, I would say, just as much as about climate. Later this year, we've got the crucial climate COP in Glasgow, but there's a biodiversity COP happening in China. That's also terribly important, and we need to get it up the agenda more.
Sounds like there's a great need for broader education within movements themselves of the various, as you put it, climate boundaries we need to be conscious of. Donut Economics does a beautiful job of putting these forth in a very spreadable kind of single image.
Yeah, the various climate boundaries, but more broadly, the various ecological boundaries. And yeah, Kate Rayworth, Donut Economics, has done a great job of sort of popularizing some of this. The original scientific work, which you can find in this Breaking Boundaries BBC program, was done in part by Johan Rockstrom and the Stockholm Resilience Institute, and they really study these various boundaries, these various what used to be called limits to growth.
Yeah, Callan, I appreciate that reframe that, it's not just climate, it is ecology as more fundamental a concern. Your own. Welcome.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you for having this room. It's very great. So I had two thoughts with pending questions that I would like to share. So one is when I personally think about change, I kind of always think in this this cocktail of fear and hope in the right dose, like in the right balance, as one of the things that's needed to kind of make change moving, make change happen. So, and I personally kind of sometimes in the face of very great challenges like the things that you are talking about, we are facing as a humanity, I sometimes feel this paralysis, and I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one. So, as in the work that you've done, like in the experience you've had over the decades, maybe you've seen maybe some antidotes to that paralysis that you've seen work really well. So I'd be very curious to know about those. And the second thing is about, because I'm a parent too, I have 3 kids, so I feel once that Elliot mentioned your book, I was kind of, my ears woke up and okay, I got to pay attention here. And it's tied to this notion of that the future is local. So, and I kind of feel responsibility as a parent to instill some sense of hope for my children. So, like maybe there's things, maybe some good approaches to make things more local and simple that I could talk about with my kids or do with my kids in a way to make them part of it in a kind of more hopeful ways. So one is about the antidotes of paralysis, and the other one is the small local things, like more focused on the kids. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeroen. Really, really crucial questions. I love them. I'm going to try and sort of take them together because I think they can be taken together. So, in terms of the question of hope, there is always hope. It's just that there's not hope for all the things that people always say there is. So if your hope is, for example, that we're going to get to carry on as we are and avoid ecological collapse, then your hope is in vain. But if your hope is that we can create a future which will be in many ways better than the present that we have, that is possible. And even if you sometimes don't feel strong enough to have that hope, at the very least you can always hope to reduce suffering, to make the present more authentic and real and meaningful. So look, what I would say in terms of how to avoid paralysis is the thing to do always is to just find a way of starting. So not to deny or suppress any of one's feelings. On the contrary, these feelings, including feelings of hopelessness, of despair, of great grief, of terror, all feelings that I've had, and I bet that nearly everybody in this room has had around this set of issues. You let these feelings have their day, and then you use them as fuel for action. And of course the action can be of all sorts. So one really good thing to do, which fits with what you were asking about and mentioning in terms of localism, is to join the relocalization movement, which is in effect a global movement. It's very sort of diverse and local, as you would expect, right? It is contained in things like the transition towns movement. It's present in permaculture, in people creating farmers markets, so many things. And then it's present more explicitly in organizations such as Local Futures, which is a fantastic organization run by my colleague Helena Norberg-Hodge. I strongly recommend getting involved with them if you really want to get, sort of seriously involved on a larger scale, as it were, in that. And consider also taking further steps. So I'll just tell you something about my experience with Extinction Rebellion, which is that getting involved in terms of going on Extinction Rebellion protests, I found hugely empowering. It's incredibly empowering, for example, to walk with a load of people out into the middle of a street, if it's a well-chosen street at a well-chosen moment, and to block it, and to realize, oh my God, we can just do this. It helps you to feel a lot more liberated from the unnecessary constraints of having to always obey the law. That's quite a full-on example, but it's a very real one. If you speak to anyone who's been on any nonviolent direct action, I bet you 10 to 1 they will say to you that it was one of the most empowering and exciting experiences of their life. And some of the way in which at a protest by, say, Extinction Rebellion, you get the sense that you are experiencing a little bit of what life could be like and of what the future society will be like. That's also very real. It's sometimes spoken of as a regenerative culture or as a prefigurative culture. And in my experience, these ideas are very, very real. So it's really a question of just doing something and getting started, and of course, potentially maybe involving your kids too. I know a lot of parents have found it quite powerful over the last few years supporting their children at climate school strikes demonstrations, and those are going to probably be growing again now that the virus is diminishing in its savagery, it would seem. So there are some possibilities, and finally I would just say again, of course, what I'm trying to say in my book, Parents for a Future, and do check it out on my Clubhouse profile page, or it's also the image of my own club, Climate Movement Strategy is the cover of the book. What I'm trying to suggest there is that it's really time now for parents to make sure that we don't just leave it to our children, because leaving it to our children is an abdication of our responsibility. We have to stand up and be counted now. So find your own way of doing that, and that itself will be a big element of how to dispel any paralysis.
You mentioned the power and empowerment of nonviolent activism. I just wanted to recognize a powerful systems changer who's come into the room, Jay Naidoo, who was actually on Nelson Mandela's cabinet. And I appreciate you giving your own a specific example of something to do. And I think that's a really, we're talking about Parents for a Future and bringing people together as parents to make change. But within that is the actual act of parenting. And our friend Stuart Williams, who sent me a message, had to leave the room, but talked about, how that can be, how we raise our kids and what we raise them to think and do. Is one of the most powerful forms of change. Just wanted to bring that in before we move to Sarah. Sarah, welcome.
Thanks so much, Elliot. Great to see you as always. Thank you for holding space. Excellent room. Rupert, thank you so much. A few reflections based on what you shared, which I found very touching. I really appreciated your emphasis on economics isn't everything. I think a lot of the systems change rooms I end up bouncing around, and just communities I end up networking within and working within, there is a heavy, perhaps overemphasis on economics as the lever for change. But something that you made me think of was perhaps, and thinking about children, was the role of the imagination, and how that children are so naturally, wildly imaginative, and how the imagination and the narratives that we create, I think, are one of the most powerful forces of change. I was thinking about USA, when we decided to put a man on the moon. It feels as if that was almost the last time we had a collective imagination to do something that we perceive might be beyond our wildest dreams, but that would somehow advance our civilization, and everybody rallied around it, and there was this beautiful iconography and all this great NASA imagery, like the power of visual art, the power of story, the power of narrative. Everything was brought to bear, and there was this collective cohesion that took place. And I think sometimes the whole idea of what is the future that we want, that's livable, that's desirable, it's given that we're talking about all these different dimensions. As you said, the Stockholm Resilience Center, we're not just talking about biosphere integrity, in one aspect. We're talking about it holistically. It's hard. We don't have a shared picture of that. So I was just wondering what your thoughts might be on the role of narrative and any little glimpses of that you've seen in children, parents, or any of your explorations. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I couldn't agree more. My own work in the area of philosophy of film and literature has been a lot about this, and that work is, I hope, quite accessible. You can see some of it on my profile page if you're interested. Basically, what I believe is that quite a lot of popular texts, especially films, are really in this ballpark and are incredible potential resources, and that we need more of them. So examples of what I have in mind, if we're talking about so-called children's films, then I would mention, for instance, Wall-E and Pocahontas. Among the films that I talk about in my book on this are Avatar, Gravity, Never Let Me Go, The Road, Apocalypto. These are films, I think, which are really in quite profound but also accessible ways, seeking to offer us narratives that could move us from where we are to somewhere very, very different. But as I say, we need more of these. I think it's a scandal, for example, that very little really has been done in this area in television. Arguably still the greatest mass medium of our time, and just show me, where are the full-length series about climate and ecological emergency on television in terms of fiction. There've been some very good documentaries, very, very good. We've talked a tiny bit about David Attenborough here, but that there really ought to be in-depth work going on that is artistic, that is accessible, that is moving, that sketches to us how the future could be. And what we need to see how the future could be if things go badly, and we need to see how the future could be if things go okay or even well. But that's hardly ever done. To tell me if I'm wrong, anybody, but I've researched long and hard in this area, and I just cannot find them. So if it happens that there is anybody on this call or anyone listening who is an artist or a creative or involved in TV or whatever, for goodness sake, please, this is the great task of our time in terms of imagination. We need to imagine together how we could get through this, and the resources that we have for that potentially in the arts are huge. As I say, there are some great examples in film. There are some great examples in literature. Ursula Le Guin, for example, comes to mind in literature. But we need more, and we need them in other media, such as TV, such as music, such as video games. Please, it's time is running out for these works of imagination. But yeah, I totally agree with you. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Such a brilliant point to wrap the room on, and this idea of having aspirational narratives and stories in films, music, movie, television shows is so vital. Not only to Hollywood, when it shows us the future, is so often dystopian. Where are these aspirational futures, these visions of aspirational futures that we want to get to, and ones that show the pathway to get there, and even better, that allow us to plug into a real-world movement. How often have we left the theater inspired, but then have nothing to do with that energy? So can we marry all of these together? And that's actually been a big... I was happy you brought that up, Sarah, because that's been such a big component of the thinking behind global unity. Rupert, I thank you so much for today, for everything you've done and are doing, and for sharing this time with us and sharing your story. Any final thoughts you wanted to share before we wrap the room?
Well, Elliot, look, just to say once again, thanks to you for hosting this wonderfully, as you always do, and to everyone who's contributed. And let me say, I'm quite a busy guy. I get quite a lot done, and I'm quite proud of that. But whatever I do is part of a team, and you don't always see that team. So it's to do with my collaborators. A lot of my work is collaborative. I mean, in terms of my writing, let alone my activism. It's to do with my research assistants. It's to do with the groups that I'm a part of that have enriched so much of what I'm capable of doing when I am capable of doing it. So, for example, we've talked a little bit about adaptation here. I'm part of a collective, the Transformative Adaptation Collective, and I owe so much to the many people in that for being able to offer the contribution to system change that I hope I'm offering. So, yeah, I'd like to end on that point, that it's always, if you will, when you see me or listen to me here, you're seeing tip of an iceberg, and I want to do justice to the iceberg, and let's not melt it. Am I starting to mix the metaphors now? You get the idea.
Spoken like a true leader. And I don't know, you mentioned adaptation. I don't know if you want to. We'll, of course, refresh people on where they can get Parents for a Future. I don't know if you want to mention your upcoming book or your newest book.
Oh, yeah. So I think you're referring to the book I've just published on deep adaptation, which is going one step further even, but it also talks a lot about transformative adaptation. That's a book edited by myself and Jem Bendell with Polity Press. You can also find that on my profile on Clubhouse. And yeah, I'm very proud of that book. I hope that's going to be a major intervention, trying to really get the discussion about the possibility of societal collapse from ecological collapse more centrally into our conversation, so that we can prepare for it, and I very much hope still prevent it.
Hear, hear. Okay, well, thank you again so much. For everyone, suggest going to parentsforafuture.org. You can pick up a copy of the book. You can also pick up a copy of the ebook very affordably. Make sure to not only grab one yourself, but share it with any parents. And as we've talked about in this discussion, we're all parents. So please support Rupert in that way. And you can find out more about Rupert and follow his work at Rupert Read, READ.net. And this has been part of System Changer Spotlight, has been part of Global Unity Radio. If you want to follow for further rooms that we run, you can hit the greenhouse at the top to follow the Global Unity Club. If you want to find out more about the movement and participate, or find out more as more is being announced, you can head to globalunity.org. I think without taking any time here, I think the spirit of it is something we all feel in our hearts, and something Rupert's definitely embodied in all of his work. So, and lastly, if you do have any folks you think are system changers like Rupert who've done incredible work that should be featured future rooms of these, please let me know. Reach out either through Twitter or Instagram. And with that, I wanted to wish everyone a great rest of the week and rest of the day, and together we can build something better. So lots of love and light. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks, Elliot. Thanks, everyone. Love and trust. Bye.